Hello everyone, I'm Mike D'Angelo with That's Entertainment, and this is your retro review of Streets of Rage by Sega. It's one of the oldest genres from the oldest consoles. Beat-em-ups became insanely popular once the 16-bit generation rolled around, and there is perhaps no better representation for the games than 1991's Streets of Rage. It had an engrossing plotline that played throughout the Sega Genesis lifecycle, and beyond. It went on to become one of Sega's most lauded series. Unlike the arguably most famous scroller beat-em-up Double Dragon, Streets of Rage focuses on a city in turmoil at its forefront, rather than the personal vendetta of its protagonists. Adam Hunter, Axel Stone, and Blaze Fielding have had enough of the corruption and quit the police force, the only way to go vigilante. Determined, they set out to topple the organization that has brought all the chaos to their streets, a secretive syndicate led by the equally mysterious Mr. X. The heroes aren't alone in their mission, though they might as well be. All they get is one renegade cop who stayed on the force, who thankfully has access to a police cruiser and some heavy firepower, which none of our fighters are armed with. Still, it doesn't quite balance the odds against Mr. X's thugs and circus freaks. If you remember the series fondly, it was probably most notably towards the latter games in the franchise. While it all had to start somewhere, the first game was bare bones indeed. You had access to the three main characters, who each had their distinct advantages and fallbacks. Some hit harder, some moved quicker, and the other was a balance of everything. But beyond that, nothing much changed. Even the animations were deceptively similar. Hell, even the special move that annihilated every minion on the screen was nearly identical between each character. The characters didn't have to rely strictly on their fists and feet, though. There were some weapons that could be used to beat the bloody pulp out of any goon stupid enough to approach you, like a lead pipe. And as always was the case in these games, if you punched through enough trash cans, one would eventually relinquish a lovely turkey dinner. This first installment didn't provide names for the thugs, and only the bosses had an indicator for their life. The only person whose name you actually know besides your own is the end boss, Mr. X himself. The stages had some decent range, with some fun stuff going on in either the foreground, the background, or as mechanics of the stage itself. Unfortunately, the further you press on, the more you realize that every enemy you face just gets recolored to make it seem like you haven't faced him or her before. Even the bosses get thrown in a few times for good measure. I'm convinced they just went home to change into costumes that didn't have boot prints smashed across them. Streets of Rage had an uncharacteristically addicting soundtrack. In fact, the music itself was so critically acclaimed that they were released outside the game a few times and are now rare collector's items. If you're a fan of the series, you probably already know that 2 more games were released and became so weird that robots and kangaroos had even made their way into the mix. What you might not know is that once upon a time, a 4th and 5th game in the franchise were planned. Unfortunately, disagreements between developers and publishers led to an implosion of the project, but you can see what Streets of Rage became if you check out the game Fighting Force for Nintendo 64 or PlayStation. Also, Streets of Rage made their rounds in the comic world. Featured several times in Sega's Sonic the Comic, the tales told beyond the video games go further into the details surrounding Mr. X, the Syndicate, and the backstory of characters like Max and Skate. While you could argue that games like Streets of Rage are pretty mindless and just rely on incessantly tapping buttons to make it from one end of a stage to the other, the fact still remains, it was addictive for its time. This one doesn't hold up as well as its descendants, but it's still the jumping point for what really started the franchise on its way. There are plenty of places to find this game these days, including compilation sets and the Wii's Virtual Console. You can even download a toned-down version for the iPhone.